right, and welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I'm your host, Courtenay, and I'm super passionate about moving and thinking. On this show, we are going to dive into all things health, fitness, personal development, lifestyle, and political sociocultural. I've always been fascinated by people, and I love learning from the experiences and stories of others. This has been a treat for me, and I hope this is enjoyable and useful for you. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or any way that I can make this a better experience for you, please don't hesitate to reach out. Hello, welcome to the Courtenay Turner podcast. I am here today with the Sound Mind Creative Group. They are working on a really interesting docu-series about the political response to the current C virus, if you will. So as always, if you enjoy this and you like this, please like it, share it, subscribe, and help us continue to grow. And so I can continue to bring content to you and talk to awesome people like I am today. How are you all doing today?
Great.
Doing good. Yeah.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Thank
fantastic.
you.
Thank you.
So I'm super excited to dive into this. I want to hear a little bit, maybe you can tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, and why you decided to do this.
Sure. So we are the Sound Mind Creative Group, which is a production company that we formed as kind of a shield for us as we're choosing to do this project anonymously. The names that we are going by are pseudonyms. We've chosen to do that for a number of reasons. We have experienced in the entertainment industry that going against the mainstream narrative, it does not always provide job security. So especially given the controversy of topics around the C virus, as you put it, we debated long and hard and decided that it was going to serve the project better for us to be anonymous. And our core group has been working in the entertainment industry for many decades, in many different kinds of capacities. We have in our group people who've been directors, editors, screenwriters, composers, music supervisors, broadcast journalists, and we've worked in all kinds of media. Just to name some projects that amongst us we've worked on, Crazy Rich Asians is one, the Fast and Furious franchise, Dateline NBC, the Today Show, and clients that range from a lot of the major studios, Disney, Warner Brothers, A&E, and the list goes on from there. So that's kind of a quick overview of who we are.
And I'll jump in and add that part of what we're doing is obviously we're speaking with pseudonyms and there's three of us who are out there hawking this thing. But we also wanted to demonstrate that we think privacy is a premium. We put a value on that, and we want to invite a lot of creatives and other film workers to be able to join us who may wish to be very, very anonymous in it. And there's a lot of people, outside the film industry who want to be part of something like this and are concerned about their anonymity and privacy. So we're it's an experiment to see how far we can push it in this method, but also demonstrate to those who want to support us, is specifically with help and want to work with us, that we can provide that protection of their identities as well. So that's it's going very well so far. Yeah.
I think I fully respect it. And, I think you can do more if your voices continue to be heard, and whatever way we need to ensure the anonymity so that happens, I, respect and will contribute to. But I think it is really sad that is the climate that we are in today, that people can't speak freely when the First Amendment it's the First Amendment, so it should be sacrosanct. And I think we're talking about things that are so incredibly important to everybody's vitality, literally their health, their wellness, their well-being, their physical survival, certainly their emotional, and all the other things that are tied to that. So I think it is really sad that we can't be more free with our discourse, but I'm grateful that we can get the word out in whatever way we possibly can. So, and that you're doing the things you're doing. So do you have anything you want to add, Matt?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, it is really disturbing that we have to go about it this way. It's almost like, I guess the powers that be, or those, that want to silence other voices, have found a kind of a way around the First Amendment, using sort of corporate power, and also just the mob mentality, and sort of the ability to rile up people, and to, mob cancellation and all that. And then you got all that stuff with doxing and things like that going on. It's just, it's very concerning, and that's a whole nother topic and a whole nother battle, obviously, but it's,
very real one.
Very concerning, and it's very difficult to figure out a solution, but for now, that's what we got to do for this. So,
and Hollywood's has been mired in groupthink for years, where we as professionals, we were already so used to having to curb our opinions. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a specifically labeled viewpoint. That we just had a lot of independent thinkers and artists who were used to free expression, and you would realize that you can't. I mean, just being a serial contrarian, or someone wants to question someone's belief system, and you would find that would have an effect on your career. The phone would ring less, and the whole aspect of in a town where I like it and love it is the closest thing you'll ever hear to a no. And from a studio exec means it's very nuanced, and everybody they want people who comply, and so it's almost like we're just seeing the rest of the world get used to what we've been dealing with for decades. So hence our precautions, but we also want to say it to a lot of people. That's all we want to do.
Yeah, I know it well. I was an actress, producer. I come from that world, so I unfortunately really understand. Yeah, and what you say is absolutely the truth. So tell me, what made you decide to do this project, and what have you, explored, and what have you maybe discovered that you didn't expect to find? And why did you focus particularly on, I mean, we've touched on it a little bit already, but the political response to COVID?
Well, in terms of the impetus, I think John can speak to that. There's a flashpoint that was the inspiration.
Yeah, well, a couple of months ago, I was listening to a podcast by Tom Woods, who's an author and well-known podcaster, and he's had a gentleman on who does charts on Twitter frequently that show the data. And very often these charts are pairwise comparisons that show two states that one might have had very strong lockdowns and mask mandates, and the other maybe not at all. For example, North Dakota and South Dakota. South Dakota didn't lock down and had better results, fewer cases, fewer deaths than North Dakota, which locked down very hard and had strong mask mandates. So in this podcast, Tom Woods said, I just wish somebody would make a high quality documentary about this stuff. It really is needed. And I thought to myself, gosh, that would really be great. I'd love to see something like that so I could share it with people. And then I kind of paused for a second. I was like, well, maybe I should do it. So I got on the phone with these guys and was like, I don't know how serious I am about this, but what do you think about this idea? And we talked, probably for a good couple of weeks before we really committed to doing it, because it's not only a big undertaking, it's a challenging one and a risky one in some ways, hence our anonymity. But eventually we decided it's one of the biggest issues of our lifetimes, not the virus itself, but the way it's been handled, and it's global. It's not just in any of our communities. It's across the entire earth that this approach has been taken. So I don't know if that answers everything that you asked, but that's basically how it began.
Well, I mean, you mentioned about what we've uncovered or discovered as we've been getting rolling on this project, and I mean, one thing is we can talk a little bit about the evolution of the development. It did start out, we were going to focus basically on lockdowns and mask mandates in particular, those specific policies. And, what we discovered as we kind of developed this, we said, well, maybe we might need to touch on, I guess on another episode, we mentioned it, we referred to it as the jab, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah,
right. The codes. All the code words.
Yeah. But,
Yeah.
you know, and then it was kind of like, well, then everything broke recently, of course, with the origin and everything, and with the lab, Wuhan lab and everything.
Some of us were talking about that a year and a half ago.
Right.
But, you know,
Exactly.
Yes.
but
Yes.
the media didn't like that so much. So we got called crazy conspiracy theorists or whatever name people wanted to attribute. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, you know, and it was, I mean, that was in the back of our mind. It's like, well, do we want to go there? Because part of the thing, we do want to make a documentary. We want this docu-series to be seen by a lot of people. So we really want to be sure, you know, we want to get it as widely distributed as possible. And if we go down too far down the rabbit hole where without enough backup and evidence and scientific data and everything else, we risk you know, sabotaging ourselves as far as our reach. So it's a interesting balancing act, and we're trying to retain some, you know, a lot of integrity in how we do the investigative journalism. And you know, that it's so, but I mean, as it evolved into docu-series because we decided, you know what, we do need to cover all of this. They're all connected, and there's some overriding themes connecting them all, which I'm sure you know, we can get into that as well.
Yeah, no, I'd love to. I do want to touch on something you just said, though, when you were saying, I fully respect, you know, the journalistic integrity, the desire to have, you know, all your evidence backed up. I don't know how familiar you are with my work, but I have a site, it's called TruthMatters.biz with 2 other partners. And that is kind of our whole MO. You know, I actually did an article on the jab. I had 32 sources in there. You can go and link, so you can go do your own research. So I don't think it's so much about the you know, not having the science to back it up. Certain elements are very new, and clinical research is sparse just because of how recent all of this is. But it's not, to me, I think the bigger concern is the opacity of information due to the suppression of information. So it's not, you know, there are very well respected, world renowned doctors and virologists and researchers who have come out and spoken with tremendous verity and substantiation to back up their claims. And yet they have been, you know, in whatever way silenced. And that's really unfortunate. So, you know, I fully sympathize, empathize, and respect all of what you're saying, but I don't think the concern, I think journalists, you know, anybody doing this kind of work should always seek to have their sources backed up, to have anything that any of the claims they make, unless they, you know, let it be known that this is just you know, an opinion and we don't have the answer. This is my thoughts on it until, you know, further information surfaces. And that's perfectly fine. We all have opinions, and we should, you know, that's how science works. You put forth a hypothesis and then you test it. But I think the bigger concern, so I just want to say, like, I fully respect that. And I think that every journalist, everybody making a documentary, any investigative work, any scientist, researcher should lead with the facts, the truth, and want to have that type of integrity. But I think we're at a time where that alone doesn't stand on its own. You know,
yeah,
it's really what's going to be permitted to be seen. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I think it's not going to be just that. I think there's going to be an element of tone, and it's going to be an element of how far we decide to go. And I think the other thing is the fact that the full docuseries, our intention is to release that next year. So I think, I mean, we're hoping with the timing of that might also help to some degree, because more and more keeps coming out. I mean, I think it's encouraging to see these emails that came out with Fauci and everything that's been going on with that, and with the, you know, now more mainstream talking about the origin. And we're hopeful that the direction means in a year from now, talking about these things shouldn't be so controversial. But I mean, that's going to be something we're going to have to see. We're going to see how that evolves.
Yeah, well, and I'll jump in to say that, I mean, we want to start with the data, because we feel that the data itself wasn't revealed fully, that there was an instant filter that was placed upon it, as you're speaking of, where we weren't ever allowed to take a look at it, either, you know, as just genuinely curious humans, let alone journalists who want to ask questions, let alone the scientific method, which is the method of asking questions to remove human error. And the fact that anyone who questioned it in any way or brought a degree of skepticism was pilloried instantly, and not just sort of after debate, and that, as you said, credentialed, high, well-esteemed scientists who said, well, we should probably look at this, would be just hammered from the get-go with the same repetitive method of takedown that we all could see happening, and it rang inauthentically. I mean, I think a lot of what we want to do is we feel that there's a large portion of people who are waking up, as it were, their sense of individuality, their sense of natural dissidence, their ability to subliminally be aware of what's authentic and inauthentic, and they're smelling the inauthenticity of it all. I mean, we started this before these Fauci emails came up, and we suspected exactly everything that's happened that just got revealed. We suspected that's what happened, as I'm sure you did, and I'm sure many of your listeners did. And we're sort of like, and it's such a huge, giant, simplistic presentation that's clearly has a narrative that appears to be designed, or at least kind of keeps finding its path of least resistance to just authoritarianism, rather than any sort of, hey, we have a major health issue, we need to look at how we protect the vulnerable, we should bring our entire scientific community to bear, bring our entire economy to bear to support that. But instead they asked all the healthy individuals to lock themselves up. I mean, it just made no sense. It made no sense. And we feel that we will start with the data, and then start with this with the skeptical scientists. I mean, we'll also speak to the scientists who perhaps are true believers in it for whatever reasons, and perhaps they can support that. But we want to hear them support it with their data, not just the prevailing media firestorm that's in their corner. And then look at the stories of what happened to people. I mean, this where the remedy far out surpasses the damage of the disease. I mean, these policies were so destructive on every level to human society, for children, adults, senior citizens. We want to look at what happened and try and capture that wisdom, because people were experiencing the psychological manipulation of everyone has been so profound, and the idea of locking ourselves up for a year, and yet that's not even in the equation as to the health and well-being of the population. There's something, we're onto something, we're all onto something, and we're working together to unveil it.
Right. Well, what was that? You don't want the cure to be worse than the problem.
That's the one. Right? I was trying to I paraphrased it myself.
Yeah, and I think that is very much what we've seen. So I guess let's break this up a little bit. You started with, you wanted to explore some of the data, some of the raw data. What were some of first of all, let me back up a second. How far are you into this docu-series in terms of filming, prep? What stages are you at?
We're going to start filming in July. We have our first shoot scheduled in July. We're primarily in the development fundraising phase. We've been building out our story development. We've been speaking with a growing number of scientists, as well as concerned citizens who are amassing the data. We're getting people to volunteer to want to help us sort it and do stuff with that. We're having a lot of, and then the networking, people like, oh, you should talk to this person. Oh, you should talk to this person. Right. So we're sort of in that sort of Malthusian growth of having a catalog of information to work with. We also just, we look at the easy examples we kind of turn to as like South Dakota and North Dakota, where there's one state, very similar states, that one had severe lockdown policy measures and the other ones didn't. And yet the nature, if you just look at the data straight up, they had almost identical spikes in every way. I mean, they follow the same thing. There was no discernible change whatsoever through adherence to the policies of lockdowns or mask mandates. And then, but then when you look at how it was reported, either by the news or by the politicians, they would only report when, there would be compliance to this, and then when it didn't show that, there was just crickets. And we're just we're mapping out that type of, when the narrative, the sin of omission is a big part of what we've been noticing in the way it's been reported at the mainstream level and at the policy level. They only reported what served their agenda.
Right. So Yeah, I think we'll maybe save that. I'd like to hear some of what you may be seeing as coming to the surface with the agenda and how it all ties together. So you went through some of the data and started to see that there's really these measures that a lot of the politicians were taking were not having the results that they were purporting to be supporting. that these measures were not necessarily serving the health crisis, quote unquote, that we were incurring.
Yeah,
Right.
well, we've spoken a lot about we've had a lot of conversations with Nick Hudson from Panda, and guys, jump in on this one because I find his we've been having wonderful conversations with him, and they're very supportive of the film.
Mm-hmm.
And he actually goes to the point of arguing that perhaps these mandates were actually not only ineffective, but in fact hurtful,
deleterious,
harmful.
Harmful not only in terms of the cost to human life, but in terms of the disease itself. I mean, he makes the point. I think he would call it more conjecture at this point, but it's certainly based in science that the requirement of wearing masks actually prevents the transmission of small doses of the disease, which serves as an inoculant, which has the potential of creating herd immunity without people getting enormously sick. So he talked about let's say somebody's walking on the beach. You see somebody, I've seen this, you see somebody walking on the beach and they're wearing a mask. So he makes the point, there are three reasons why they shouldn't be wearing a mask. First of all, it's not going to spread outdoors. What we've seen is that it spreads mostly indoors, mostly in hospitals and in people's homes. So there's no reason to be wearing a mask on a beach for that reason. Secondly, a normally healthy person is not going to contract it outside. And if they do, the severity of it will likely be mild given the statistics. But the third and most important point is that if that person has it, there's been this concern about asymptomatic transmission, and he doesn't entirely dismiss, he meaning Nick Hudson, who we were talking about, he doesn't entirely dismiss the possibility of asymptomatic transmission. He says it's possible, but it's so far removed from possibility that it's statistically insignificant. But if it is possible, the amount of inoculant that is going to be spread is so small that it actually helps people build immunity rather than creating the disease. So he offers that as an explanation of why it might be possible that in places like South Dakota, the number of cases and deaths is lower by a small margin than in North Dakota, where they lock down so severely. So yeah.
I mean, we have immune systems. We've always had immune systems.
No.
And this whole
No.
and it's shocking, and it's as if in some of the recent conversations we've been having, it's the mathematical models that everything was projected on was like, if you had it and you contacted somebody, it was if magically you got it, and the immune system was no longer brought to bear as something to be considered, as if we're always being exposed to viruses. We're always being exposed to the environment around us. And we have a very vast, this incredibly complex organism called our human body designed to handle that. And that's just been sort of poofed out of existence in all of this, in all the coverage and the way we're supposed to deal with this. And meanwhile, we're just left with this weird shaming and shunning where it's like, oh my God, don't come near me without your mask on, in the most severest of ways.
Well, I just add to that real quick. The other thing, I mean, besides being incredibly complex immune system, it's individual to individual. It's incredibly complex and in many different ways different. Different people's immune systems can be a lot different in the way people react to different things. So another, and we'll get into that, but I mean, another case or another reason why sort of top down, blanket policies are pretty ridiculous, because it doesn't take into account all the tiny differences.
And then human ingenuity to figure it out for themselves, what works, what doesn't work, and learning from that. And that we should have had
the knowledge of their own bodies and their own health. And the other thing that was just so mind-boggling and infuriating to me personally is that, and I'm sure to many others, but that everything that you would think to do to boost your own immune system, right? Like what helps you fight off things like colds and flus and typical viruses? It's not isolating and avoiding human interaction. Socialization is one of the strongest immune boosters, particularly when it's around loved ones and common themes and interests and things that fuel you energetically, right? So that's number one. So now we've taken that away from people. Now they're afraid of other people, and we have to separate, atomize, and isolate, which is very detrimental to our psyche, to our physical well-being, and it lowers our immune system and increases stress. And then the other thing is all the deemed essential businesses. I found this like so mind-boggling. The fact that liquor stores are essential, donut shops are essential, but let's close down gyms and like dental offices. And I think I made a joke to my mom at one point because I couldn't get in to see my dentist. And I said, I think they're hoping that I'll be so drunk and I'll have rotted my teeth so much with all the donuts that I won't notice and I won't care. Like I'll have no teeth to worry about. Like, I mean, I was being facetious, but really, I mean, where's the common sense in this? We know that your oral health is very closely linked to your heart health. So why, and now you're dealing with the virus that is contributing to vasculitis and heart issues and respiratory symptoms. Why would you then, contribute to that further by not letting people get care, and particularly, things like dental care,
and this whole idea of essential versus non-essential businesses gets to the heart of one of the main themes that we're planning on approaching in this documentary, which is that centralization is a major eroding of civilization.
Yep.
And the idea that somebody can determine what is an essential or non-essential business, it's not only problematic, it's absolutely impossible, because the question is raised, essential to whom? That job is essential to that person's family. That job is essential to a community who receive those services. The idea that just medical services and restaurant or grocery stores are essential and everything else isn't it's absolutely ludicrous on so many levels. And one of their core tenets here is that only on the ground solutions, people trying things out, figuring things out based on their value systems and their understanding of reality, can solve problems of this magnitude. They can't be solved from the top down, no matter how severe the crisis. Let's say that the imperial college model was right, that the severity of the virus was as terrible as they thought it might be. Even then, the only way to solve it is to let people be free to figure out how to solve it, not prescribe to them how to do it from the top down. And that's, while we are going to focus on the data, the ultimate conclusion here is that people have to be free to figure out how to solve these problems.
Yeah, so well said. And that's absolutely true. I think it is only the ingenuity and creativity of individuals that have really come up with profound solutions. And you need the freedom to be able to explore and experiment and go through the trial and error process. And as you said, that is what science was supposed to be. That's the scientific method. It is that trial and error. It's the hypothesis and the testing and, seeing how long that lasts over time and then testing it again. And if we are not allowed to have inquiry and investigation and individual freedom, then how can we hope to achieve true progress where you really do discover solutions? And a lot of times, which I think, Matt, you were saying that, it's never going to be a blanket solution. You can't have a, suitcase prescription for everybody. it just doesn't work that way because we are all so incredibly unique in every facet possible, intercellularly, externally, our personality, our lifestyle, it's all very, very varied. And as a result, we need to be able to explore different ways of handling it. So,
and you also can't determine which values a person should hold. I mean, you think about the idea that elderly who are in nursing homes shouldn't be visited by their family. I've heard a number of stories of elderly people who have died alone in the nursing home. It breaks your heart, to hear these stories. And okay, let's say there's some risk that they might get COVID. They should have the choice to take that risk. If it's more important to them to be with their family in their last weeks, why shouldn't they be allowed to make that choice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So what are some of the other things that you are discovering along this process?
It's a good question. It grows. Well, one thing I do want to just comment on is, where it was the essential versus non-essential, and now the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. There seems to be a distinct theme of otherizing within the narrative. It just keeps growing and it keeps evolving. But there's this constant. People already spoke about the divisive nature of the politics within this country for various reasons of various administrations, and we may or may not want to get into that. But there was already a strong separation. Okay, but the otherizing of anyone who thinks differently, if you don't comply to the groupthink, then you are being otherized, you're being dehumanized, and then the sort of projection of, I argue that I feel that. I mentioned this earlier, that there's this inherent insecurity of people's beliefs. They're being told what to do. They don't actually know. They haven't used their own critical thinking. They haven't used their own powers of analysis to derive a decision for themselves, as what we've just basically been describing as to how to best proceed. They're getting told what to do, and they're being told what to do by people who pretty much seem to be presenting inauthentic arguments, but are just saying it over and over and over, using psychological marketing techniques to just demand compliance to that. And I think, and therefore they're insecure in their views, so therefore that generates a fear, but they're projecting that fear as into hatred of the other. So they're being the amount of animosity being hurled at the otherized folk, be it the non-essential workers, the non-mask wearers, those who hesitate at getting the jab versus the jabbed, is concerning. It feels designed, and it feels as if it is an attack on the individual and the individual's ability to make decisions for themselves. So it's basically reaffirming what was said, but I just feel that otherizing is a major theme that we just that we see it throughout whatever angle you come from.
It's the Hegelian dialectic. Yeah, yes. Absolutely. Yeah. And, we've seen this historically throughout, all political realms and any means of governance. And we're seeing it now. And I'm inclined to agree with you. I do think it is by design. It's much easier to divide and conquer. It's much easier to control a divided society. It is, and pit them up against each other. And it's also easier when human beings, as complex as we are, it's much easier for people to deal in absolutes. It's much easier to, fall into binary thinking. And the reality is very few things are binary. There's some things in like absolute mathematics, some like realms of physics. I would say we can get into, it's black and white. There's really no shades of gray here. 2 + 2 is 4. I don't care what they tell you. 2 + 2 is 4. I know they want to try and tell you it's 5, but I'm going to tell you that they're wrong on that. Well, we've got lots of data here, but I think that human beings tend to feel like that's very uncomfortable, and they prefer to fall into, and the people who, we will call them the powers that be, they know this about human nature. And so they do tend to, pit them into this binary trap. And then it's easy to, keep the downward spiral of the Hegelian dialectic. We're going to create this crisis, then we have our reaction, and then they present this miraculous solution, which is, usually a horrendous synthesis that creates another problem. And we're seeing that now, right? So if we look at this trajectory, right, we had this pandemic, and then we have these measures, right, which create a further problem. People are getting sicker, dealing with other issues that weren't necessarily present before, right? We saw huge spikes in suicide, in depression, in abuse of all types, substance and familial, and all sorts of problems that were spiking as a result. Certainly an economic decline. And now we've got this great solution. We've got jabs for you, and that's not necessarily been so wonderful for everyone, right? So that's where you guys you went into a little bit of exploration on that.
Yeah, we're working our way into that. Yeah, it's been. I mean, one aspect. I mean, we're going to talk about the jab, of course, but I think and that'll be a particular episode. But we are going to spend a fair amount of time within that episode talking about treatments as well.
Yeah, please.
Because that's kind of been taken off the table. It's just like, well, we're just there's just this one line, like to end this pandemic, everyone needs to be vaccinated, and it's just like that's been kind of thrown to the side. So.
Well, and so I don't know how much investigating you've done on this, but personally, what I've discovered, and I think this is part of the reason why we know there's so much suppression of the treatments that were available. And one of the reasons for that is that they would not have qualified for, the EAU, the emergency use authorization, EUA, sorry. But they wouldn't have qualified for that if there were affordable, accessible, and effective treatments, right? So what were some of the things you discovered about some of these treatments and how the response to that?
Well, certainly we. Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Well, I was just, I mean, along that, I mean, there seems to be that's been developing quite a bit. I think, I mean, as a step back, it's kind of like we want to kind of ask a few questions, for one, just even diving in, what really is the risk of death or severe illness for people if they do get COVID? I mean, for one thing, that needs to be considered to be able to weigh out sort of the risk benefit of anything like a vaccine or whatever, and given some of these treatments that are here now, the risk continues to go down. Of course, we know under age of 50, unless you have severe comorbidities, you're probably going to be fine. But the other thing is just asking about if there is lasting immunity from catching COVID naturally. I mean, that's something that's kind of been thrown to the side. They don't seem to be considering that. It still seems to be, even if you've had COVID, they're encouraging that you should still get the vaccine. So that's the other thing. And then, like I said, with the treatments and how treatable is COVID, because I mean, if we have treatments that are highly effective, it really, I mean, then it really changes. I mean, at first it seemed as though no one knew anything. And I recall, the whole ventilator fiasco, and we'll talk about that. I mean, it was, we needed ventilators. We need to, send ventilators here. We need more. And it turned out that, and I haven't heard, they don't say anything about it anymore, but it seemed as though that was not a particularly effective treatment, that may have caused more harm than good. So, I mean, we've come a long ways since that, but yeah, I mean, all those things need to be considered, and surrounding the jab conversation too. So.
Yeah. What did you find with the, you were saying that you were finding that the ventilators may have done more harm than good. What did you explore anything in that regard? Like, why were they promoting it? How did they find that? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't dug in real deeply on that, but there's certainly, as that became not so much standard of care. I mean, that seems to, we've shifted away from that as a standard of care at one point. And I remember there was talks about, ventilators on their own, even without COVID or not, can cause permanent damage to the lungs, and that it's very much a last resort. So.
It can cause pneumonia-like symptoms in which you then promptly die of COVID. I mean, it was an absolute, I mean, remember how intense it was about ventilators for a long time. That was the lead in the news forever. And Cuomo's like, oh, we got to get ventilators and distribution of it. And now we hear nothing about it. And it's no longer an issue. It just goes down the memory hole. They rely on the amnesia of the short-term memory of society, and then move on to the next thing to keep that kind of that fear, that drip of fear in your psyche, just moving on to the next thing, whatever it takes to keep the mind moving forward. And we think the ventilators are an example of a temporary hysteria that was concocted for the most part, perhaps. I mean, we have to figure this out. We're gonna have to dig into it, but that's our suspicion.
Yeah, sure. So what were some of the other things you discovered or that you're going to address? Yeah.
Let's see. Well, I mean, we talked a little bit about this before we started speaking, but I mean, one of the aspects of the jab is that there are despite this constant reassurance that there's no long-term effects of this here jab, we know very well that they cannot make that claim because it's a brand new thing, that there's nothing more than a year or two out there. There are not the studies. There's not the deep. I mean, usually these things take the FDA approvals take years, and then you really only know the long-term effects after many, many years. And we have come across a general theme of concerns when it comes to the reproductive system and fertility and whatnot. When it comes to the jab, this is relatively new for us, but we are noticing that's getting brought up a lot to us by the people we're speaking to, and so there's a concern there. So we're going to look at what that might mean for those who wish to be cautious because they choose to be cautious until they understand what the jab represents in terms of the long-term health and their ability to reproduce.
I think another important theme that we'll tackle regarding the jab is bodily autonomy and people's right to make decisions about that kind of thing, as we were talking about before, without shaming and peer pressure to conform to, in a way, for me, that's a more fundamental issue than the science of the jab, because the question is how people should be able to proceed based on their assessment of reality and the risks, and we're seeing so much pressure across the board for people to fall in line and take this step.
Yes, I'm glad you addressed that, because I think the science of it is very important, because people cannot make informed decisions if they are not adequately informed. So I think that is really important as well. But I think first and foremost, I agree with you that there needs to be choice. This cannot be, and they can't, what I don't like is what I'm seeing is this governmental pressure, but then they're obfuscating their, any kind of liability by suggesting that they pushed it onto the corporations and to private businesses. But meanwhile, they've incentivized them, they've pressured them, they've scared people. They've used all sorts of very manipulative tactics. And when people don't have, that's one of the fundamental, values of this country that I think needs to be protected, is individual freedom, and particularly, what happened to my body, my choice, right? So, people choose and when I talk about the science, I think the science is important, but people make choices all the time that aren't always in their best interest, but they do it knowingly. We know alcohol is a poison. We can kid ourselves about it. And I'm certainly guilty of having my occasional cocktail, a glass of wine. I enjoy it, but I know I am ingesting a poison. I know that I'm doing something where I may pay consequences, and I weigh that out. I know I can't drive a car afterwards. I know that my next day I might not, crush it, at work or the gym. I know that there are consequences to be had, but I'm making that choice for myself. the same thing with people now who smoke cigarettes. I mean, the list goes on and on. We are constantly adjudicating risk versus reward. The problem lies when, one, we don't know what the risks are, and two, when we are now facing so much pressure that our lives have become encumbered by wanting to protect our health, because we know that this is not a good choice for us. Some people are, don't want to drink alcohol, and they know that there are social consequences for that. There may be people at a party that make fun of them or whatever, and these pressures are astronomical. Their lives are being tremendously altered. We're experiencing, children whose parents are concerned about what schools are going to accept their kids if they're not taking these things, and flights and whatnot. But there's lots of potential ramifications that are not so great.
Yeah, there's another piece of that too, and it kind of ties to all that. I mean, especially the way I guess the government, like you said, kind of put the responsibility more on the corporations and even just the general public to shame one another. And it one thing I've thought a lot about that is there seems to have been something happened to where it's like medical history and personal medical choices is no longer a private matter, and that's concerning how that's shifted. That people feel they can openly just ask, "Have you been vaccinated?" as if that's should be public knowledge, or even to more extremes. Whether it's COVID passports or having to wear a patch or a badge or something. Yeah.
So I want to just touch on that briefly and really clarify that, because I think there's a huge difference between an individual asking somebody, because we do know there may be consequences of being in close contact with somebody who has been injected. So, that to me is very different than a business asking you, or than a requirement like wearing some sort of a badge, or, having to have some sort of a passport. So that's the problem, is when it goes out of the private into a public, and by public, I don't just mean a governmental, I mean the public square. That's a huge concern. When somebody asks, privately, that's your private relationship with that person. And you get to decide how close you are, how comfortable, and that person should know, their own self, if they feel comfortable sharing that information or not. And everybody still, as far as I know, has the wherewithal to say, I don't feel comfortable, I'm not going to share that with you. Last time I checked, we're still capable of doing that, right? So that's a private thing that's very different. I think because what's happened is the shaming has become so intense,
right,
that people have blurred the lines between private interaction and public.
Yeah, I think that's kind of part of it. And and it depends on the context. I think mainly it's more not so much about people not revealing private information, even if they're individually asked. It's obviously their choice to reveal that, but in certain circumstances, if it's clearly, you're in a grocery store and you're not wearing a mask, and now I guess apparently if you're vaccinated, you don't need to wear a mask, but if you're unjabbed, then you do need to wear a mask. And if it's like, well, are you have you taken the jab? Because you're not wearing a mask, you should have to be able to say, well, that's private information.
Yeah.
You don't, that's none of your business.
For sure.
But it still feels like that's something that can be asked, and it might not be an employee, it might be another customer in the store or something like that. So it's, and online is a whole nother story, of course.
Or it's like we're getting to the point of like Attack of the Body Snatchers, where I'm not going to respond to that. Oh, unbeliever. I mean, it's the so you are part of the problem. I mean, it's everyone's making it their business and becoming an informant. I mean, I'm a big student of East Germany, and it's just sort of a population that wants to inform on everybody and report on everybody, and a Stasi like environment. I mean, everyone always, I'm going to say this. I think National Socialists aren't, I mean, the constant like, oh, it's about the Nazi and the Gestapo. No, it's about Stasi. This is Stasi behavior. I mean, the National Socialists were a problem for a time on that side, but I feel that we're having an extreme issue with heavy Stasi like, KGB like problems. And I think it's important to call it properly for what it is. I mean, this need to, where are your papers? Didn't end with the Gestapo. It continued very well into the 20th century with East Germany and all of the Eastern Europe and all of the Soviet satellite states. Just my 2 cents on that.
No,
I think the Stasi words are what we should.
I
look
absolutely
to
agree
model.
with you. I think that's exactly what's happening, and that is exactly what we're seeing. And I think it is right to label it that way.
Because if you're not, because if you're not supporting the statist system, then you're outside the system and aren't allowed to participate in society, which is where you opened up our conversation with this. Unless you comply, you're not. The emphasis is then you will not get to participate in society, and that evokes so much from the Stalinist, Maoist ways of thinking, that unless you comply entirely to the state, then you are an unperson. And I think there's very clear echoes here.
And I also think it's important to notice where we're putting the microscope as we're talking about these issues, because for example, Courtenay, you just brought up the issue of a business asking about vaccine status, jab status. Sorry. Yeah. And in my ideal form of the world, I believe a business has the right to ask that question. If they don't want somebody that's unjabbed or jabbed in their business, that's an individual right that the business has in a pure sense. But I think it's really important to look at how governmental policy and influence is shaping our society, both in terms of there's a parallel there with the issues of free speech. Yeah, sure, Twitter and YouTube have the right to deplatform somebody if they want to, but we have to look at the broader picture of
with Section 230.
How
they don't fully. It's a public square,
okay.
But that's another conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole other conversation. But let's leave that aside for a second. Yeah. Say, okay, yeah, they're a private company. They have the right to make those decisions. But if what we want to foster is a society of openness, free exchange of ideas, and then we need to discourage that kind of censorship, even though it's on a private level. And I think the same thing is true with questions about health privacy, and we also have to look at how the government is covertly influencing that conversation and that dialogue. Because if we just put the microscope on the private business and don't look at the broader context, then we're not having a discussion about the entire picture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm so glad you clarified that. I'm in 100% agreement. I think the problem is that the government pressures on. So my point was more about, and I think you two spoke to this as well, that it's the governmental pressures on these businesses. We saw this with the masks, right? With the masks, they were going to be fined if they didn't have this requirement. So certainly a business could, and many did. There were some that I even went so far as to say, you are not allowed in here with a mask. That you cannot enter if you're wearing a mask, which kudos to them. I mean, that was a very bold move. But a lot of them paid the price because there were fines and regulations that were sanctioned upon them. And so that's my concern, is what is the government doing to shirk their own liability and push it off onto these businesses. And a lot of these businesses can't afford and can't withstand to make their own choices and take a risk outside of, those types of measures. So this brings me to my next question. I think, John, you were talking a little bit about one of the main themes of your docu-series, and one of the main themes that you've kind of come to realize is that a lot of this is around the intention of centralization, or maybe that's the result. The intention could be, we need to discover, but certainly we're seeing that that's the result, is centralization of many things, and how harmful that could be, and how antithetical that is to our founding structure. What are you seeing? How is that playing out? How is the response to this outbreak playing into that?
Well, certainly, we talked some earlier about how that kind of centralization of political authority, centralization of scientific knowledge, all of those things interfere with the on the ground ability of people to make choices and discover solutions. And certainly regarding the virus itself, had people been free to take action based on their assessment of the situation, their knowledge, their understanding, I believe personally that our understanding of the problem would have come about very quickly. We would have grasped the parameters much more quickly than we do when somebody from the top says, here are the solutions, here are all the things you have to do to solve this. And then we don't get information because we can't. It's only by people making all kinds of different choices and having consequences as a result of those choices that information, I mean, that's the principle of the free market. That's why things flourish in a free market, is because people are making all of these choices and failing. Businesses fail and businesses succeed, and we learn what works, and then that there's momentum to that. And the same thing is true with medical issues. When things are controlled from the top down, there's not that possibility. And that's true. I mean, I think that's true across society. And it's also, one of the things that Nick Hudson has pointed out to us about this issue is that if you're concerned about equality in a society, you should be in favor of decentralization. Centralized approaches inevitably lead to massive gaps in equality, and people suffer as a result of it. And so that brings up another issue for us, is that the audience that we want to speak to with this project, we consider it the live and let live crowd, people who kind of have an innate understanding that people should be let free to live their lives. And our belief is that there's a whole sector of society who should be deeply concerned about the issues that this crisis has brought to light, that would normally identify themselves as liberals, as progressives, but they have so thoroughly swallowed the mainstream narrative that they're not paying attention to the destruction of the scientific method, which they normally value, to minorities who are suffering terribly as a result of this crisis, which they're normally concerned about, to the disadvantaged who are suffering as a result of this, which they're normally concerned about. I mean, what businesses are going to go under or have gone under? It's the small businesses. It's not the big box, businesses that are going to suffer.
We're getting subsidized by the government, by the way.
Exactly. Yeah, sure. So all of those issues, we think, our desire is to bring all of this to light in a way that hopefully that sector of society might have an open ear and recognize, oh yeah, those are things that I care about. Maybe I need to kind of question my evaluation of this situation.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit to that. Just it's also, I mean, another challenge of making the case for decentralization with, as far as solving complex solutions is we need to, and we're such a, I think we're trying to, I'm right now trying to find a better way to put it, because it doesn't, it sounds almost condescending, but in some ways there's a lack of imagination and a lack of trust in something decentralized, and especially when you add a large dose of fear. The fear, I think, you just automatically, I think, instinctually just tend to go to a centralized response, and we need to find a way to open people's minds to the sort of the kind of organic, spontaneous innovation that can occur with decentralized approaches. And we have to do it in some ways to show some of those, but also in some ways we need to sort of enrich people's imagination and understanding of how that works, so that they can realize, well, there's, because we can't always point to every possible solution that might come out of that. That's the thing. It's like, well, if we don't do this centrally, if we don't solve this problem this way, and we don't do a lockdown, or we don't do this, how do you expect it's going to be fixed? It's like, well, we don't really know, but we do know something innovative, something we can't imagine will occur. It'll emerge, and that's a tough sell, and we're still developing on ways to also bring that theme to part of the centralization issue.
Just a quick story about that. There was a church in Canada that decided that it was important to them to be able to see each other in their worship service. So they decided to hold basically a drive-in worship service. So they all gathered in their cars. I don't know how they managed to hear each other, but they were social distancing. And I don't remember which province it was, but they were surrounded by cops and told to disperse. And that, like Matt was pointing out, that was an innovative solution. Let's assume social distancing was really important. They were honoring that scientific truth, quote in quotes, but they were breaking the law. So it was an innovative way to solve the problem, but because it wasn't what the authorities had prescribed, it was not allowed. And it's just kind of a concrete example of how people can innovate and yet still work within the confines of the concerns.
Yeah, I saw that. That was heartbreaking. It really was heartbreaking because, at a time, let's say this really were a health crisis, obviously we've seen from the data, it was not quite the health crisis that they claimed it was, but let's say it was, then, why strip people of their hope, right? Isn't, worship and faith and being surrounded by loved ones and like-minded community, that we know that elevates people, that it, in some cases, it literally cures them. Like one of the people who live the longest are usually people who, have that socialization and are around loved ones and community. We have lots of data to back that up. So why would you take that away from people? So that leads me to my next question. What are some of the things that you're finding, or maybe some conclusions you've come to from what you've seen this far, as to why they're having these responses? Because it seems to certainly goes against logic. But I would actually argue it goes against a lot of the science as well. They keep saying, follow the science, but they seem to have repudiated a lot of actual science in the process. So why would they take these measures if they're not logical and not scientifically supported?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And hopefully, maybe we'll that's something we're going to have to explore carefully, I think. But
I do. Just to tag onto that, I do think that an area that we probably will explore some is the World Economic Forum.
Yeah,
and this idea of the Great Reset. One thing that I think we've said this before, we want to be careful about is speculation. Because we want this to be seen by as many people as possible, we don't want it to be easily dismissed as having conspiracy theories I certainly personally have consumed a lot of documentaries that speculate about these things, and it's interesting to watch, but very often it gets derailed when they start making trying to draw conclusions where there's really not the evidence to draw them, and that's something we want to be careful to avoid.
Sure. I know when we had spoken on the phone prior, you're like, I don't want to dig too much into that. And I fully respect that. I will tell you this. I know I'll tell you a couple things. One, I don't know if any of you have read Gary Allen and Larry Abraham's book, but one of his lines that I love that he ends it with is that conspiracy can only survive in the dark. So now conspiracy theories are in fact just that. They are theories, right? Just like scientific theories, like all theories, until they're proven, they're just theories. However, to say that no conspiracies exist would be a lie. We know they do exist. I'm not suggesting necessarily that this is, I'm just saying conspiracies in general do exist. And I think that it is dangerous and non-productive to dismiss the possibility that there couldn't be, because if something is happening and it goes against logic and science and the results are deleterious, then investigation needs to ensue, right? We need to have people inquiring, why is this happening? And if it's an honest mistake, that needs to come to light as well. I think, there's nothing wrong with, we're human, we're fallible, we make mistakes. And, if there were more ownership for, hey, we messed up. And, there was a doctor out of Canada, Bridal, who did just that. He said, we made a big mistake. He talking about the spike proteins, and they had talked about how the injections were thinking that injecting the spike protein would be a great antigen and this would help to inoculate the population. And he said, we messed up. We did not realize that was the toxin. And we are now injecting toxins that do go through the bloodstream. They do not stay located in, like in the injection site. They do have the potential to cross the blood-brain barrier, all of these things. But he admitted we made a mistake. It was a very honest stance, and that's respectable. So I will say that. And then the other thing I will say is that in terms of substantiation, as covert as people may think it is, if you do some digging, it's a very deep dive, but a lot of the information is actually really right out there in the open in terms of the WEF. Their website it's so comprehensive, but it's really it's not hidden, So I think that might be a great resource to start with, certainly for but I understand that for the nature of this, I think it's really important you have to pick and choose your battles, right? So we want people to open their eyes and be receptive to information, and then, lead them, guide them, and hopefully use the drip approach to get them to do more research, because again, it's not going to be a blanket for everyone. Some people come to conclusions very differently from one another. So, yeah.
Well, I'll add somewhat an answer to your question about, just the nature of power. Authoritarian regimes are very jealous of their power, and they understand that story and narrative and control of that narrative is absolutely essential to controlling power.
Yeah.
And the level at which we have seen the narrative and the story controlled, and the fact that we are all carefully using language that won't get censored by other very controlling corporations and entities that are out there, reveal that there's a real, and I speak of the insecurity. If we tell good stories that are authentic, cut to the heart of the matter, it's a threat to the power base that wields this authority, and they are so jealously controlling the story, as with every method they can right now. All we have to do is keep talking to each other, keep sharing our stories, telling the stories that are empathetically compelling, because it's the matter of, because they're using our emotions against us. They've generated this nonstop fear. But and that's the way we work. We ingest knowledge with story. We have to have an emotional story with thresholds. Knowledge gets applied to that, and that's how we pass along wisdom. We're oral storytelling creatures. And if we
logical.
Right. And if we tell a very good story that pushes back against those who are controlling the story and are trying to take power for themselves and never give it back up to the people, then we're doing the right work. And so it's pushing against this authoritative sort of power vacuum that is trying to control us. And so we believe in the strength of story, and that's why we're making this film and asking for financial support for this film. We're doing quite well. So far, all of our money thus far has come from podcast audiences. We've raised over 80 grand from podcast audiences alone, because we can't advertise, because the keywords will get us banned. So we're doing the rounds, and we're understanding that just sharing the story, even in this platform, is making a difference. And we're asking for people's support to make this film so this story can do the fight, can get into the fight for us.
That's amazing. And that speaks to the power of the individual, right? That's like
exactly.
Grassroots citizens who are concerned and inquisitive and curious. And yes, absolutely. I think all of us having been, filmmakers or in the entertainment industry, we respect, we honor, we cherish storytelling, and we know the power of it. And for so often, just as much as it can be used for, propagandistic purposes to promulgate lies, it can also be used to propagate the truth and to, even just promote inquiry and critical thinking and exploration and imagination, as you were saying that. So I think that I love what you guys are doing, and I am so optimistic and hopeful that this will at least begin people down the road of inquiry and exploration. So.
Speaking of stories, an important aspect of what we're doing is we're trying to gather stories from people all around the world that have suffered at the hands of these policies, and we, on our website, soundmindcreativegroup.com, we have a portal where people can basically write to us and share their story. And, we're looking for the right stories that will really help land this narrative. And obviously we'll respect people's privacy. Nothing will be shared until we have consent forms in place. But we ultimately will want to interview some people and film people and have them be a part of the documentary. So we really would ask anybody that's listening to this that has a story that they think is relevant to share it with us at our website.
I love that. Well, I will tell you, I don't know if you guys are familiar, that this podcast was born out of the lockdowns, and it was literally my antidote to really, I don't want to, put light on it. Like, I was seriously depressed and anxious and really not in a good place. And I needed human interaction. So, and I started reading. I tried to write, actually. So a lot of people know the story, but I'll share it again. It sounds like you guys don't know it, but I had tried to write. And the first day of the lockdowns, I literally sat at the computer for 10 hours straight. And the end of the day, I had a blank screen in front of me. So I was really successful, as you can see. But I was just too anxious and overwhelmed with just the weight of the world. Yeah. And I'm very empathetic. I'm a very empathetic person. What? So yeah.
I was just gonna say, sorry, there's a delay. No, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, so I couldn't write. And well, long story short, I ended up, people had suggested doing podcasts, and it was terrifying to me, but I was like, well, then I would get to talk to people. And that was because I had started to read a lot, because when I couldn't write for 10 hours, I knew the creative process well enough that I was like, I can't push this. I'm obviously not in a place where I can write. But I ordered like a stack of books, and I just started reading. And then I felt like I had nobody to discuss all these ideas with, which is the fun part of reading. And my mother was wonderful. She listened to me as I chewed her ears off about like all the books that I had read. But then people had suggested the podcast, and so that was how that was born. But I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Alan?
Oh, I was going to say there's a small delay, but I'll say that writing is a very difficult medium. I mean, it's a cherished medium. It is a very important medium, and it is the cornerstone of our academic world and development of the Western world in a lot of ways. Yeah. But oral storytelling is the old way of doing it. The poets of old, the way we can incorporate story into our being and then regurgitate that whenever we need to. You meet someone, you start talking to them, and you need the power of conversation, the power of sharing story, the fireside chat. That's how we're wired. And the fact that we are, the emphasis, I should just sit down and write that. It takes a lot of time to do that. And now with the technology, the fact that you can do podcasts and just sit there, that we just had an hour-long conversation, the four of us going all over the place in a wonderful way. And this is the power of human networking, the power of oral storytelling, and the power of sharing story. And it's great that you yourself discovered that isolation from that was detrimental to your health. We think that's part of the story. That you've discovered that through the modern technologies, you could reclaim your ability to have conversations and share your story. And we think this is the power to undoing the damage from the last year from these policies that isolated all the individuals from each other and feared for their own well-being. The sort of a narcissistic, neurotic sort of takeover by the what is it when you're fearful of hypochondriacs, and it's like, like I'm no longer, I don't want to hold space for the hypochondriacs anymore. I want to interact with people. I want to have conversations. I want to share stories. And that's all ultimately we're doing with this project. And it's going to push back.
I love it.
I love that you put, and you discovered that for yourself by creating this wonderful podcast. So thank you for having us on. Thank
you so much for being on. Do you have any other? Yeah, I'll go around to each of you.
I'll quickly say, so our fundraiser, so we're on a website called fundraiser.com. It's FUNDRAZR.com. Sort of funny spelling on razor. Fundraiser.com/follow the science. If you go to that, and I'm sure you'll add the link to on your page, but that's where we have been developing our base, and we've had over 500 donors. As I said, we've already brought in $80,000. If people can give $5, wonderful. If they can give more, wonderful. But by donating at $150 level, we have a certain community. Is that the we community that we're inviting people to be part of?
Yeah.
And then above that, we have a $500 level where we're actually asking people who give at that level become advisors to the film, and we're developing another community for them to share ideas on how to present this. So we're building a community, and we're building a donor base, and we're really appreciative of anything that anyone can give. And we thank everyone for their time of listening to us.
That's awesome. I love it. Do you have any, I'll go around. Do you have any other kind of closing remarks, things you want to say about it, or? Yeah.
I think the only other thing that we hadn't mentioned was we're looking for the stories, of course, as John had mentioned, and as Alan mentioned, of course, we're raising funds for the film, but also, anybody who might have different skill sets that could contribute to the documentary in some way or another, have worked in film or what have you, are welcome to contact us as well. We're going to be looking for people, as this gets into production and such. So
we're increasing our Rolodex in the old parts.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
We hope to make this film and many more on controversial subjects under this banner. So we'd love to build that out.
Yeah. So yeah, anybody, and anyone can reach us too for any of these things through Soundmind Creative Group at protonmail.com. That's our email. So anyone that has any other skills they may be able to contribute, welcome to contact us as well.
Awesome. I love it. You, John?
So I'll just add, two quick things. One is that we didn't mention that we are planning on releasing basically a pilot episode of this in the fall. We planned on doing it that way because we felt like there might be a possibility of resurgence of cases and these policies resurging again in the fall. So we wanted to get something out by then, but we knew we wouldn't be able to get the full series done by that time. So that'll be a 20 to 30-minute version, and that's really kind of our current focus in the fundraising campaign, is getting to 100,000 in order to really have the funds for just that pilot. But I'll also say that, in our journey as filmmakers, we've been involved in a lot of projects that we enjoy and get behind and get excited about. This is something fundamentally different from that. All of those things are true, but we believe that this is a critical story to be told for the future of our civilization. That if there aren't competing narratives out there to counter the mainstream perspective on this, then the underpinnings of our civilization are being threatened. And so we hope that people will recognize the seriousness of what we're trying to do here and get behind us, both financially and in terms of joining us in the community that we're trying to build, because it's critical. It's critical because there are going to be documentaries. There are going to be a lot of documentaries about this, and I'm already seeing it on Netflix, stories that incorporate the mainstream narrative, which are in some ways even more powerful narrative stories that get at you on your subconscious level. It's not about the intellectual approach. So there's going to be a lot of stuff out there that supports the mainstream narrative, and we have to have stories out there that counter that, or we're lost.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm so appreciative that you're taking on this mission. I agree. I think the underpinnings of our civilization and potentially our civilization will be eroded otherwise. So I think that it's really imperative. Very, very grateful. So you'll send me all of the info. I will have links for everybody to find you when you launch, to chip in for the fundraisers, and to contact you with any questions or support they can offer. Thank you all so much for being here. Yeah.
Thank you, Courtenay.
You're welcome.
Yeah, super fun.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, this is great.